Murder in the Fog, an Inspector Price investigation. Chapter 1. The Letter at Dawn. The fog hung thick over London that morning, the kind that blanketed gas lamps and muffled the sound of carriage wheels. The clock on St. George's struck 6:30 when Inspector Price stepped down from his handsome cab onto the cobbled street of Belgrave Square. The letter summoning him from Scotland Yard had been marked urgent, for Inspector Price's attention only, and that was seldom a harbinger of good news. The townhouse at number 19 stood shrouded in mist, its iron gates ajar. A uniformed constable met Price at the foot of the stone steps and gave a sharp salute. "Inspector, sir, the housekeeper's the one who rang us. Says Lord Harland's vanished. No trace of him since last night." Vanished? Price's brow furrowed as he adjusted the lapel of his long wool coat. And the household? Just the housekeeper and one footman on duty last night. The rest of the staff had leave. What with the household away in Bath? They've searched the house twice over. His lordship's bedroom was locked from the inside, but when they forced the door, he was gone. Price said nothing, merely nodded and ascended the steps with the sure-footed confidence of a man who had stared into the aftermath of many a dark deed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of burnt paper and Turkish tobacco. The grand entryway gave onto a hall of marble and gilt-framed portraits, but the household was eerily silent. The housekeeper, a pale and stiff woman named Mrs. Dobbins, met him near the drawing-room. "Inspector, Lord Harland was to dine with a gentleman from the Foreign Office last evening, but he cancelled at the last moment, said he was expecting a letter of utmost importance. When he didn't come down for breakfast, I sent the footman to rouse him. The door was locked, as always, but when he didn't answer—" "You broke it open," Price finished. "Show me the room." They ascended to the second floor, where thick carpets hushed their steps. Lord Eustace Harland's bedroom was a richly furnished chamber lined with bookcases and heavy drapery. A fire still smouldered low in the hearth, and a half-burnt envelope sat atop the grate, its edges curled like dead leaves. "Don't touch anything," Price said sharply, stepping forward. The envelope's remnants were delicate, but the writing had not been completely consumed. With gloved hands, Price lifted it gently and peered at the partially visible script. "Des Deux Mondes, Rue Saint-Honoré, Paris." Lucy Price's eyes narrowed. A French address, and a signature that was little more than a looping C, scrawled in violet ink. He tucked the fragment into an evidence envelope and turned his attention to the room. The bed had not been slept in. A decanter of brandy sat untouched on the table. The wardrobe was closed, but inside, a travelling coat and walking stick were missing. Price turned to the housekeeper. He kept no valet. "Not since the war, sir. He preferred to be left to his own business." And his own business, said Price thoughtfully, was often more complicated than people suspected. For Lord Eustace Harland had been more than just an idle aristocrat. He had served in the diplomatic corps before retiring abruptly 5 years prior. Rumours had long circulated that he still kept company with men from the War Office, quiet suppers behind drawn curtains, coded telegrams arriving in the dead of night. Price stepped to the writing desk, where a blotter bore the impression of a recently written letter. He held it to the light, but could make out only fragments. "Too dangerous to delay. Expecting you in Paris. Le Corbeau." Le Corbeau. The Raven. A name Price had not heard in years. It had surfaced once in a file on a French anarchist group operating at the edges of espionage, a group rumoured to have infiltrated diplomatic circles and military command. The name had never been confirmed, but its sudden appearance now stirred a chill in his blood. He turned back to Mrs. Dobbins. "Did Lord Harland say anything else yesterday? Receive any visitors? Anything odd?" She shook her head. "Only the post. One letter, which arrived late in the evening. I left it outside his door on the tray, as usual. By this morning, he was gone. And the letter was burned." Price crossed to the windows. The curtains had been opened slightly. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the garden. which meant, unless Lord Harland had descended from the balcony like a stage magician, he had left through the house, and no one had seen him go. "Fetch me the footman," Price said, "and have someone prepare a list of all post received in the last week. Also, I want any remaining correspondence sent to and from the Harland family, here or in Bath." "Yes, sir." He remained alone in the room for a moment, staring into the embers of the fire. The echo of that name, Le Corbeau, kept tapping at his mind like a crow on a church window. This wasn't just a missing person. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. And if his instincts were right, the answers would lie, not in London, but in the city of shadows and secrets, Paris. Chapter 2. Whispers from the Seine. Paris greeted Inspector Price not with charm, but with sleet, and a chaos of clattering carriage wheels along the boulevard Haussmann. It was just past 3 in the afternoon when his train from Calais pulled into Gare du Nord. He stepped onto the platform, beneath a vaulted iron roof, slick with condensation, his coat already damp and his mood grim. Customs had been brief. His credentials from Scotland Yard still carried weight, especially when accompanied by a discreet envelope from the British Embassy. Waiting by the steps near the station café was a familiar figure, Inspector Lucien Favre of the Sûreté Nationale. Slighter than Price and always dressed a touch too elegantly, Favre wore a dark green overcoat with a silk scarf and held a thin cigarette in gloved fingers. His moustache twitched into a knowing smile when he spotted Price. "Ah, mon vieux, Scotland Yard sends its best into our reign." "And France sends its charm into our murder cases," Price replied with a brief nod. "You arrive and suddenly we have intrigue again," Favre replied. They shook hands, a strong professional clasp that belied their long history. They had worked a case together once in Brussels, some years ago, and neither had quite forgotten the other's methods or temper. "I need discretion," Price said as they walked toward Favre's automobile, a sleek black de Dion Bouton waiting by the curb. "This isn't an official inquiry, at least not yet." Favre's eyebrow arched. "Then I suppose you're not here for the view from Montmartre?" "No," Price said grimly. "I'm here because a British Viscount was found dead in a Paris hotel, and it wasn't suicide." They drove through the wintry streets, the buildings looming like grey fortresses. At Price's request, Favre took him first, not to the police headquarters, but to a small café on the left bank, the Café Mauclair, where Lord Harland had allegedly been seen several days before his disappearance. The café was modest, the sort frequented by students, artists and men who preferred to drink in shadows. Its wood-panelled walls were stained by decades of pipe smoke, and a small stove glowed in the corner. The proprietor, a bald man with a broken nose, gave Favre a nervous nod as they entered. "Tell him we're here about the Englishman," Price said softly. Favre spoke to the man in French, rapidly but calmly. The proprietor's eyes flicked toward the back, then toward Price. He muttered something in reply. Favre returned. "He remembers Harland, came in 2 nights ago, sat in the corner booth, was meeting someone." "A woman?" Price asked. "Yes, English too, red-haired, well-dressed. They argued. He paid in francs. She left first." "Did she leave anything behind?" The proprietor hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a folded piece of drawing paper. On it was a charcoal sketch, rough but expressive. It showed the outline of a man in a coat, seated with his hands clasped, a vague suggestion of weariness about the eyes. In the bottom corner, in soft pencil, C.W. Price turned it over. Blank. "Clara Winfield," he murmured. "The painter. You know her?" "Only by name. She's been mentioned in diplomatic gossip. Kept company with a few officers posted abroad. Last known address was in Montmartre." Favre smiled slightly. "Shall we go find the mysterious mademoiselle?" Montmartre was cloaked in drizzle and melancholy as they arrived just before dusk. The studio in question was on Rue Lepic, a narrow winding street that curled up towards Sacré-Cœur like a ribbon of wet stone. Favre knocked on the door of number 37 while Price stood just behind him, eyes scanning the upper windows. After a moment, it opened. The woman who answered was in her late 20s, tall and striking, with red hair swept into a careless chignon and a long, ink-smudged smock covering her dress. Her face, though tired, held intelligence and pride. "Clara Winfield?" Favre asked in French. "I speak English," she replied, her voice crisp but guarded. Her green eyes flitted from Favre to Price. "And I assume you're not here for a portrait." Price stepped forward. "Inspector Harold Price, Scotland Yard. We're investigating the death of Lord Eustace Harland." A brief flicker passed across her face. Grief or guilt, or perhaps memory? She stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The studio was sparsely furnished. The walls hung with bold dramatic sketches of cityscapes and faces captured in urgent lines. Several canvases stood turned to the wall. A fireplace sputtered with a weak flame. "I saw him," she admitted once the door was shut. "2 nights before it happened. He looked worse than I've ever seen him. Thin, jumpy, paranoid." "What did he say to you?" "That he was being followed? That someone was watching him? He asked if I still had—" She hesitated. "If you still had what?" Her fingers twitched. She crossed the room and pulled a leather-bound sketchbook from beneath a pile of magazines. "This. I sent it to him by post after our meeting. I thought it would remind him of who he used to be." Price took the book. As he flipped through pages of sketches, his eyes narrowed. Hidden among the drawings of streets and cafes were peculiar symbols, circles, triangles, runes, almost mathematical in structure. A cipher, and then halfway through, a portrait unmistakably of Lord Harland, seated at the Café Mauclair. "Did he say anything else?" Price asked. She was silent for a moment, then looked up at him with something between fear and defiance. "He said, if anything happened to him, I should remember the name Le Corbeau. That's all. Just that." "You understand, Miss Winfield," Price said gravely, "this isn't just about a missing nobleman. If Harland was carrying something, documents, knowledge, or information, it may have been worth killing for." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I burned the last page." Favre stepped forward. "Burned what?" She looked between them, then said simply, "The last sketch. The one he made me draw. It wasn't of a person. It was a place." "A place?" She hesitated. "Yes, a building. Somewhere in Paris, I think. With a clock tower, and a raven carved over the arch." Outside, the fog was beginning to descend over Montmartre, and Price knew now, without a shadow of doubt, that this case was no longer about a single murder. It was about a name from the past, a cipher in a sketchbook, and the quiet rustling of wings in the darkness. Le Corbeau had returned. Chapter 3. The Englishwoman in Montmartre. Price stood before the tall, arched window of Clara Winfield's studio. Evening had fallen completely, cloaking the cobbled streets below in a dusky veil, and the golden dome of Sacré-Cœur loomed faintly above the rooftops like a ghostly eye. Behind him, Clara Winfield stood in silence, arms folded. "Let's begin again," Price said without turning. "You claim you had no idea Harland would end up dead. You hadn't seen him in months, and yet he comes to you in Paris, alone, on the eve of what we now suspect was murder." Clara's voice was cool but strained. "I didn't ask him to come. He sent me a telegram, 3 words. 'You were right,' that's all. No explanation, just a time and place to meet." "You told us earlier that he was frightened. You said he asked you if you still had it. What was he referring to? The cipher in the sketchbook?" She nodded slowly. "I thought he was referring to an old drawing he'd once given me, back in Algiers, years ago. We were close for a time." Her gaze drifted to the fire. "But when I handed him the book, he barely glanced at it. He said I needed to destroy the final page immediately." "And did you?" Clara hesitated. "Yes. I threw it into the stove the moment he left." "What did it show exactly? You said it was a building, a clock tower." "Yes, stone archway, carvings around the lintel. I didn't recognize it, but he said He said it was where the last meeting would happen, that if he didn't survive to tell the story, someone had to remember the place. Father, who had remained silent till now, leaned forward. Did he mention a time, a date for this meeting? Clara shook her head. Only that it was coming soon, and that someone close to him had betrayed him. Price glanced at her sharply. Did he say who? Number only that it was someone who'd once sworn an oath to the crown. Price's eyes narrowed. That could mean anyone, from a diplomat to an army officer to a man in Parliament. Clara gave a faint, bitter smile. Then you've got your work cut out for you, Inspector. After leaving the studio, Price and Favre walked in silence along the sloping Rue des Trois Frères, the wind biting at their collars. Paris at night was a different animal, its romance and grandeur giving way to alleys of quiet menace. You believe her? Favre asked at last, his breath clouding the air. Partly, Price replied. She's hiding something, but I don't think she killed him. Nor do I. Favre lit another cigarette. But this cipher in the sketchbook, it bothers me. These symbols, they are not merely decorative. We should take them to someone who knows such things. I already have someone in mind, Price said, stopping beneath a flickering street lamp. A man named Aubert Bellamy, retired codebreaker, lives in the Latin Quarter. He helped our people crack messages during the Boer War. Harland knew him. In fact, Harland once called him the only man in Europe who could outthink a German spy. Then perhaps we should pay him a visit. Price glanced at his watch. Tomorrow morning. Tonight, I want to examine Harland's hotel room. The Hôtel de la Régence on Rue Saint-Lazare was modest but discreet and favoured by foreign officials, visiting scientists and members of the press. The night concierge, pale and sweating, let them in with a nervous bow, his eyes darting from Price's credentials to Favre's badge. Room 212 had already been sealed by the sûreté. Favre unlocked the door, allowing Price to enter first. The chamber was sparsely decorated, a desk, a bed, a wardrobe, and a side table where an empty glass and a half-full bottle of cognac still rested. The smell of stale smoke lingered in the air. A faint trace of lavender soap remained near the basin. Everything was in place, too perfectly placed. Price crouched near the body outline, still faintly marked on the carpet. The knife was found here, Favre said, pointing, in his right hand. But there was no blood trail, no struggle, just a deep wound to the heart. Odd for a suicide, don't you think? Very. Price circled the room. Harland was left-handed. His war files confirmed it. Shrapnel wound in his right arm. He wouldn't have stabbed himself like that. He turned to the wardrobe. It was closed. He opened it slowly. Inside hung two coats. One was Harland's, a fine wool garment, lined with silk and monogrammed at the breast. The other was anonymous, no initials, slightly too small, and in the inside pocket, a train stub. Calais to Paris, Price read aloud. Dated 3 days ago. Someone else was staying here, perhaps watching him, perhaps waiting. And the gloves? Favre asked, pointing to the bureau. A pair of leather gloves sat neatly folded beside the lamp. But as Price examined them, he noticed something odd. One glove was worn at the fingers, the other was almost pristine. These aren't Harland's, he said grimly. They're too small. They were left here to make the scene look untouched. Whoever killed him wanted us to believe he died quietly. Favre glanced at the doorway, and yet they overlooked the glove, the ticket. They were in a hurry. Or they wanted us to find them, Price murmured. Back at his hotel that night, Price couldn't sleep. He laid Clara's sketchbook open on the desk, studying the ciphered drawings by candlelight. One sketch in particular caught his eye, a raven with its wings spread wide, carved into the base of a spire. Beneath it, the initials L.C. Le Corbeau. He tapped his pen thoughtfully. The name had first appeared in intelligence files around 1898, linked to smuggling operations in Algeria, arms deals in Marseille, and coded telegrams intercepted in Brussels. Always indirect, always shrouded in rumour. But if the sketchbook was right, and if Clara was telling the truth, then Le Corbeau was not a single man. It was a network, one that had waited patiently in the shadows for years, and now, with Harland dead, it had begun to move again. Chapter 4. A Murder in Rue Saint-Lazare. The morning dawned grey and cold. Paris shivered beneath a veil of sleet, the streets glistening like mirrors, as Inspector Price stepped out of the Hôtel Saint-Roch, his coat collar turned high. The sketchbook lay in his briefcase, wrapped in oilskin. He had read it 3 more times in the quiet hours before dawn, scrutinizing every symbol, every curve of Clara's delicate pencil strokes. What was clear now was that Lord Harland had not only uncovered something dangerous, he had been terrified of it. The cipher, the meeting place, the hint of betrayal from within his own circle, this was no simple murder. And yet Harland's death was still officially classified as suicide. Price intended to change that. Aubert Bellamy lived in a cramped ivy-covered flat above a closed apothecary in the Latin Quarter, not far from the Pantheon. Once celebrated for his work-breaking Boer code patterns and German military encryption, Bellamy had quietly faded into semi-obscurity, finding solace in rare manuscripts and tobacco pipes. He opened the door, wearing a dressing gown that might have once been red. His spectacles, perched on the end of his nose, magnified his sharp grey eyes. When he recognised Price, he gave a weary smile. "Inspector Price, I wondered how long it would be before you came knocking again. Still chasing riddles in the fog, are you?" "I have one you might enjoy," Price replied, stepping inside. Bellamy's flat was as chaotic as ever. Books stacked on every flat surface, old maps curling along the walls, and the scent of pipe smoke mixing with stale coffee. Price handed him the sketchbook. It belonged to an Englishwoman, Clara Winfield, but the contents may have come from Lord Eustace Harland. "He's dead." Bellamy said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes suggested recognition. He opened the sketchbook with care, running his fingers over the pages like a blind man reading Braille. "Interesting. These are nested ciphers, visual but structured, a code within a drawing. See here, look at the repetition of angles in the buildings." He tapped a sketch of Paris rooftops. "Coordinates? Possibly." He turned the page. "Ah, this is clever. The raven, see the feathers? They form a visionnaire grid." "And what would it spell?" Price asked. Bellamy lit his pipe and studied the image for a few minutes, muttering to himself. Finally, he looked up. "It spells a name, Vautier." "Vautier?" Bellamy nodded. "A surname, old Parisian, likely connected to the meeting place Harland mentioned. Do you know of such a place? A building with a clock tower and a carved raven? It was the subject of the final page. Clara claims to have burned it," Price said. Bellamy thought for a long moment. "Rue Vautier, that's in the 16th arrondissement. Used to be a Jesuit library, I believe. Abandoned after the Commune. The facade had gargoyles, one of which was a raven. At least, that's what I was told. Most people avoid the place now. It's privately owned, but no one knows by whom." "That's where Harland was going," Price murmured. Bellamy looked over his spectacles. "Then I'd be careful, my friend. If he ended up dead, and you found what he was carrying, then you may be next." Later that afternoon, Price returned to the Hôtel de la Régence, this time alone. He had questions, more than the answers Bellamy could provide. Something about the room did not sit right with him. The scene of the crime was too composed, the story too tidy. The concierge blinked when he saw him. "I thought the investigation was closed," the man said, nervous. "It's been reopened," Price lied. "By order of the British government. I'd like to see the guest ledger." The concierge hesitated, but eventually retrieved the book. Price flipped through pages until he found it, 3 days before Harland's arrival. A name written in sharp, slanted hand, Mr. Cyril Talbot, London. Price knew that name. Cyril Talbot was not a stranger. He was a mid-level attaché to the British Embassy in Paris. Affable, inconspicuous, well-liked. But he was also rumoured to have sympathies that leaned uncomfortably toward the German side of recent political disputes. He was the kind of man who smiled too easily and listened too closely. Price asked the concierge which room Talbot had stayed in. Room 209, monsieur, and yesterday also, room 214. He climbed the stairs quickly, quietly. Room 209 was unoccupied. The bed was stripped, but the wardrobe was still open. The chambermaid hadn't finished resetting the room. Price stepped inside. He moved with the efficiency of experience, checking drawers, the window ledge, under the mattress. Nothing. Then in the fireplace grate he saw it. A slip of paper, partially burned, curled like a dying leaf. Using tweezers, Price removed it and examined the charred edge. The ink was smudged, but a few words were legible. Shipment to leave Marseille on the 14th. Harlan's delay cannot be tolerated. He pocketed the paper and stepped out, closing the door behind him. He was just moving towards room 214 when he heard a woman's loud scream. He ran around the corner to the room. A maid was standing by the open door to room 214, hands to her mouth, pale as linen. Inside, a man lay slumped over the desk. Blood pooled beneath his chest. A pen had rolled from his hand, and a telegram sat half-written on the blotter. Price pushed the woman gently aside and knelt beside the body. It was Cyril Talbot. The sûreté arrived within 20 minutes, and Favre followed 5 minutes after that. He entered the room and stared at Talbot's body, his mouth drawn into a tight line. Dead less than half an hour, Price said. Still warm, no signs of a struggle. Favre looked at the telegram on the blotter. Courier compromised. Harlan dead. Sketchbook possibly intercepted. Initiate closure. That's all. He was sending it when he died. A message to whom? Price glanced at him grimly. Whoever is running this operation. Talbot was silenced, just like Harlan. Then you were right, Favre said quietly. This isn't about a man, it's about a machine. A network, Price agreed, and the head of it may be right here in Paris, or in London. Favre crossed his arms. Do you still plan to visit Rue Vautier? Price nodded slowly. Yes, tonight. Favre raised an eyebrow. Alone? Price's answer was steady. Number, you're coming with me. Outside, the fog rolled in again. Chapter 5. The Cipher in the Sketchbook. The streets of the 16th arrondissement were eerily quiet. Inspector Price and Inspector Favre stood before the iron gate of the abandoned Jesuit library on Rue Vautier, its Gothic facade looming like a sentinel. Time and neglect had aged the building. Its arched windows were stained with grime, and ivy clung to the stone. The ornate carving of a raven, perched above the keystone of the entrance, had eroded but remained unmistakable. Even in dim moonlight, its wings were outstretched as if it were guarding a secret. This place, murmured Favre, scanning the darkened structure, gives me the same feeling I get in morgues. Appropriate, Price said, considering what it may be hiding. They had come armed, Price with his standard-issue British Webley revolver, Favre with a French Chamelot Delvine. A key provided by a sympathetic archivist at the Ministry of Culture had granted them access to the grounds. The door creaked open with a moan of rusted hinges. They stepped into darkness. The air inside the library was thick with dust and the scent of forgotten paper. Moonlight filtered in through broken stained glass, casting fractured colours across the cracked tile floor. The entry hall had once been majestic, vaulted ceilings, soaring columns, oak shelves, but now it lay in ruin. I'll take the left, Favre whispered. Price nodded and moved right. He passed long-forgotten tables, overturned chairs, and shelves still stacked with books in Latin and Greek. The silence was uncanny. No rats, no wind, no creaking. In a reading alcove at the far end, Price stopped. There it was, the image from Clara's sketch. A raised platform beneath a wall of shelves, above which hung a disused clock. Beneath the timepiece, a carved stone archway. And on the central stone, precisely where Clara had drawn it, was the weathered relief of a raven. He stepped up carefully, brushing away cobwebs, and ran his fingers along the bird's outspread wings. Nothing moved, no panel slid, no passage opened, but then he noticed it. beneath the raven's talons, faintly carved into the stone, almost invisible beneath years of soot and grime, 7 small dots arranged in a triangular pattern. From inside his coat he pulled Clara Winfield's sketchbook and turned to a particular page, the raven symbol. On the left wing, Clara had drawn a series of minor tick marks, easy to dismiss as stray pencil lines, but Bellamy had said they were a Vigenère cipher, 7 dots, 7 letters. He took out a small notebook and began decoding. Cipher key, CROW. Using the sketch and the cipher method, he worked through the marks with quiet precision. The decoded word emerged 1 letter at a time. REQUIEM, Requiem. What have you found? Father's voice echoed softly as he reappeared, pistol in hand. Requiem, Price said. It's the key. He pressed on the arch where the raven's claw met the stone. It gave way, just slightly, then clicked inward. There was a soft grind of gears. A panel in the rear shelf swung open, revealing a narrow passage behind the wall. They exchanged a glance and then stepped inside. The passage led to a subterranean chamber, a crypt of sorts, hidden beneath the foundations. The walls were lined with rows of locked cabinets, and an old wooden table strewn with files, ink pots, and brass candlesticks. An oil lantern sat nearby, and Father lit it, casting flickering shadows across the stone. Price moved to the files. They were marked with initials. BHEJTLHCT. Realization hit him then. CT meaning Cyril Talbot. He opened the folder. Inside were meticulous records, intercepted telegrams, notes from meetings, dates of train travel, surveillance reports. All filed in English and French. Talbot had been followed and documented by his own allies, or perhaps his enemies. Here, Favre said, holding out another folder. Lord Harland. Price flipped through it. Harland had been working with an informal intelligence network within the Foreign Office, tracking suspicious diplomatic transactions between French anarchist cells and British intermediaries. Harland had grown suspicious of a leak in Whitehall. He'd compiled names. Clara's sketchbook had been a method of encrypted record-keeping, art disguising espionage. 1 page stopped him cold. A letter from Harland to Clara Winfield, dated only days before his death. It read, Clara, if anything happens to me, know this. The Raven is not a man, but a council. 5 of them, operating across borders. Talbot was only the messenger. The real traitor sits in London, beneath the Union Jack itself. Trust no one. The Raven is a committee, Price said aloud. Favre nodded grimly. An international cabal, using old diplomatic channels to move information. They kill their own to keep secrets buried. I need to get this back to London. If what Harland wrote is true, then someone high up, someone wearing a British medal, may be pulling these strings. Just then they heard it. Footsteps. Above. Heavy. Intentional. Favre blew out the lantern. The room plunged into darkness. Price and Favre crouched low, listening. 2 men by the sound of it, speaking French, quick, clipped phrases. One held a lantern. Their boots echoed on the marble above as they approached the opening in the wall. We need to get out, Favre whispered. Back passage, Price murmured. They scanned the room. In the far corner, beneath a draped tapestry, was a stone staircase. They ran for it. The stairs led them up into what must have once been the librarian's quarters. The exit was rusted shut, but Favre's shoulder brought it crashing open. They burst into a side alley off Rue Mozart, panting in the icy air. The files were still clutched in Price's coat. Behind them, the building loomed. That night, Price sent a telegram to London, addressed to a man he trusted more than most, Sir Alton Wrexham, Director of Domestic Affairs at Scotland Yard. Urgent. Raven is a council, harbouring agents in Whitehall, en route to London with proof. Price, he turned to Favre in the flickering gaslight. They'll come for Clara next. Then we must protect her, Favre said. And quickly, Price's jaw set. Chapter 6. The Secret at Dovercliff Manor. The English countryside greeted Inspector Price with grey skies and cold suspicion. Dovercliff Manor rose above the Hampshire landscape like a sleeping beast, stately and immovable, with weather-stained turrets and ivy curling across stone walls. Once a proud family seat of the Harlands, it now seemed to sulk in silence. Price arrived just past midday, his overcoat dusted with road dust and his temper sharpened by the grim weight of his Parisian findings. In his briefcase were the ciphered documents recovered from the underground chamber in Rue Vautier. Names, ledgers, surveillance logs, and most important one of all, the letter from Lord Harland himself, suggesting that Le Corbeau was not a single man, but a network operating on both sides of the Channel. And now Price had a name that hadn't appeared in any foreign dossier, but had surfaced time and again in whispers at Westminster. Lady Eugenia Harland. The younger sister of Lord Eustace Harland, Eugenia was known in London society for her striking beauty, acid wit, and political dinner parties attended by men with names rarely printed in the press. She was no fool, educated in Geneva, fluent in 4 languages, and long suspected by Price to be more than the decorative sister of a titled lord. But it was what Harland had left unsaid in his final letter that troubled him most. The traitor sits beneath the Union Jack itself. Was it metaphor? Lady Eugenia received Inspector Price in the drawing-room. She was dressed in a deep emerald gown that matched the steely green of her eyes. At 38, she bore the elegance of a woman sculpted for society, but Price had seen enough to know. This was a woman who played chess, not cards. "Inspector Price," she said coolly, "you arrive unannounced again." "My apologies," he replied, removing his gloves, "but as your brother was found murdered in Paris and I now carry evidence that suggests he uncovered a treasonous conspiracy, I trust you'll understand the urgency." Her mouth tightened. "If you're here to make accusations, you may do so plainly. I detest melodrama." Price gave a faint smile. "So did your brother? He preferred facts." She motioned to a decanter. "Brandy?" "No, thank you. I have a warrant," Price said, removing it from his coat and placing it gently on the side table, "to search Dovercliff Manor, specifically your brother's study, his safe, and any locked rooms on the upper floors. You'll find little of interest in Eustace's papers. He was a man of many thoughts, but very few of them useful," she said. "I think otherwise." He turned toward the hallway. "I'd like to begin with the study." The late Viscount Harland's study was a cloistered room of wood and shadow. Heavy drapes filtered the daylight into long golden bars across the carpet. Dust clung to the spines of books on politics, espionage, and continental affairs. Price's eyes moved quickly. A map of Europe stretched along one wall, dozens of pins embedded in ports, railways, and river routes. He opened the writing desk and began flipping through ledgers. "France, Germany, Russia, every movement Harland made since 1899 is recorded here," he murmured. He pulled a file labelled Dossier-Confidential. Inside were letters addressed to Harland from contacts at the Foreign Office. Most were coded, others redacted, but one, unsigned, caught his eye. "The woman you trust most is the one with the most to lose. She's made promises on your behalf that you do not know you've made." Price stared at the letter. The woman, Eugenia? He heard footsteps behind him. Lady Eugenia stood in the doorway, arms folded. "Still digging through ashes, Inspector?" "I was just reading a note," he said, rather pointed, "about a woman you may know." "I know many women, few worth quoting." Price stepped toward her. "You were close with Cyril Talbot." She didn't flinch. "I knew him, yes. He was assigned to the Paris embassy. We corresponded. He was found dead 2 nights ago, stabbed while sending a coded telegram implicating Lord Harland. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Chapter 7. The Trap at the Opera. Paris shimmered with deceptive brilliance that winter evening. The Palais Garnier, crown jewel of the city's cultural life, stood radiant beneath the glow of gas lamps, its golden statuary and sweeping marble staircases drawing carriages like moths to a flame. The opera house would be full tonight, not just of nobility and art patrons, but of diplomats, emissaries, and, unbeknownst to most, several individuals tied to the most clandestine power circle in Europe. And at the heart of the crowd, watching from the shadows, stood Inspector Price. He adjusted his evening cravat in the gilt mirror of the lobby, disguised under the formal trappings of a visiting English dignitary. His overcoat hung from his arm, revealing the faint bulge of his service revolver beneath his tailcoat. To his left, at the top of the grand staircase, stood Inspector Lucien Favre, his French counterpart, equally disguised in formal attire, scanning the gilded balconies with quiet intensity. Tonight, Price wasn't chasing clues. He was baiting a trap. The plan had been set into motion 48 hours earlier, shortly after his confrontation with Lady Eugenia Harland at Dovercliff Manor. The files retrieved from the underground chamber on Rue Vautier had been copied and distributed to select members of Scotland Yard and the French Sûreté, trusted men who owed no allegiance to Parliament or any foreign court. The intelligence pointed to a single location where a final meeting was to occur, the Palais Garnier. The sketch recovered from Clara Winfield's notebook had depicted the opera house's chandelier from above, an angle no patron would ever see. Hidden among its artistic flourishes was a time, 9 p.m, and a cryptic phrase, "Final overture, second balcony, box V." Someone was coming tonight, possibly the architect of the council, possibly Le Corbeau, and Inspector Price would be waiting. By 8:30, the opera house was a hive of elegance. Perfumed women in silk and lace strolled arm in arm, with generals and statesmen. From the orchestra pit came the delicate tuning of violins and cellos. The audience took their seats for the performance. From his box on the opposite side of the theatre, Price watched Box 5 discreetly. Curtains drawn, empty, for now. At 8:56 a man entered, tall, lean, with grey-flecked dark hair, and the bearing of nobility. He wore a black tailcoat and carried a cane. Price recognised him at once, though he had only seen his portrait in confidential government dossiers. Sir Edmund Rothwell, ambassador, decorated veteran, former intelligence coordinator, and the man suspected by Lord Harland of orchestrating both his downfall and the cover-up that followed. Favre's voice crackled softly in Price's concealed earpiece, an experimental French device only recently introduced for field communication. Subject has entered Box V, confirming identity. Rothwell. Alone. No guards visible. Acknowledged, Price whispered. At precisely 9 o'clock the lights dimmed and the overture began. As the music swelled, Price slipped out of his seat and moved through the back corridor toward the service stairwell, which led to the box level above. At the top of the stairs, a disguised Sûreté officer nodded and stepped aside, allowing Price through. He stood directly behind Box 5 now and waited. Inside Box V, Rothwell appeared relaxed, almost amused, but Price could see his right hand tapping out something on the balustrade. Morse code, a message, report incomplete, second courier dead, secure Clara Winfield, British agent compromised. Rothwell paused, then tapped again, awaiting reply, but no reply came. The council had likely gone silent, unsure of what had leaked and who had betrayed whom. Suddenly Rothwell's posture changed. He stiffened, his head turned ever so slightly, as if sensing the presence behind the wall. Price moved. He pushed open the rear maintenance door and entered the box. "Good evening, Sir Edmund," he said, voice steady. Rothwell turned slowly. "Inspector Price, I had a feeling." "You always did like the opera," Price said, stepping closer. Rothwell's eyes gleamed. "Are you here to arrest me?" Price nodded. "For conspiracy to commit treason, espionage, and the murder of a British lord and a diplomatic officer. You were the 5th chair at the council." Rothwell's smile didn't waver. "The council was inevitable, Price. It's not treason, it's evolution. 5 men, 5 nations, maintaining the balance of power without war. You'd prefer we return to the old model? Secret alliances, surprise invasions, world conflict? You murdered Lord Harland. He was weak. And Clara Winfield? Rothwell paused. Unfortunate, but not yet. Price stepped forward. She's safe, protected, unlike you. Then Rothwell did something unexpected. He reached into his coat, not for a gun, but for a silver capsule. Favre's voice blared in Price's ear. He's going to take poison. Price lunged. The capsule hit the floor and rolled beneath the seat. Rothwell fought like a man half his age, fists sharp, trained. They crashed into the balustrade, knocking over a champagne flute. A startled gasp rose from nearby boxes, though the music masked most of the scuffle. Favre burst through the rear entrance with 2 Sûreté officers. It took all 4 men to subdue Rothwell. He was handcuffed, disarmed, and dragged from the box, his face red, his voice quiet. As they led him down the back stairwell, he turned to Price and murmured, "You can stop me, but you'll never stop them." Outside, the fog had returned to Paris, thick and clinging. Price stood on the marble steps, coat wrapped tight, as Rothwell was pushed into a waiting police carriage. Favre lit a cigarette, face drawn. "You think he was telling the truth?" he asked. "That there are more?" Price didn't answer immediately. He thought of Clara, now hidden under guard in the British embassy. He thought of Lady Eugenia, who remained untouched for now. He thought of Harland, who had died because he dared to know the truth. "I think we've uncovered the head of the viper," Price said quietly. The next day, Price was back in England, satisfied that the murderer was caught.